Hey everyone, good evening. Thanks so much. I see people already introducing themselves in the chat. So welcome. And yes, I see people were asking about how to join. We were waiting to start. So really glad to have you here this evening. This is a big topic in a lot of ways. We are going to cover a lot of information, and there will be a replay available. So I just want people to rest assured you don't have to frantically take notes. But also, especially importantly, I will send this out in the follow-up email. But throughout this, there are a number of different worksheets that we incorporate into this, because really this is a topic that has a lot to do with reflection on yourself, on your own needs, on your support system, on your ability to ask for help. And so it's great to spend this time sort of learning about it, thinking about it briefly, but ultimately the thing that's really going to help is to be able to spend some time on your own, kind of, I think, coming back to some of these things. And I know for a lot of people, having the prompts and guides of worksheets is really helpful. So I'll send that out to everybody afterwards, but I'm also going to put, for those who really like to have things in real time, a link to where you can download those worksheets in the chat. And then, that way they're there. I encourage you to hold off, unless I know some people really love that, having everything, just because I know it's easy to then get into reading the worksheets rather than listening to what's going on. But it's totally up to you. So I'm only very briefly going to introduce myself, because if you are here, it is probably because you already know who I am, or at least what your grief is. We really only shared this on our email list and on Instagram, so you're probably connected with us one of those two places. But in case you have never been to one of these webinars or seen our faces before, I am Litsa. I'm one of the two co-founders of What's Your Grief, and one of our small but mighty team members here. I'm a clinical social worker, a grief therapist, and I think importantly, a griever too. And as many of you know, Eleanor and I founded What's Your Grief way back now, and it's late 2012, early 2013, when the internet was a very different place for grief support. We were working together for an organization where we were providing grief support to families who had experienced traumatic and unexpected deaths. And we would meet folks in the hospital at the time they were finding out that the person had died, and we would work with them for up to 2 years, sometimes even a little longer afterwards, here in Baltimore, Maryland, which is where we're based. And in that work, we were often looking at the grief resources that were available, and kind of really questioning, would we have ever used these in our own losses? We had both been through personal losses that were significant, death and non-death losses. And we were often thinking we wouldn't have used this. We don't feel great about sharing this. And we had more and more people who were saying, counseling and support groups are not really my thing. Do you have any recommendations online? We were struggling to find things online that we felt were really both clinically sound, but also accessible and down to earth and whatever. And so with that, What's Your Grief was born. And we've been doing this ever since. So this is a topic tonight that we are going to talk about, because I think it is one of the things that we hear so commonly. It's just this feeling that I know I'm struggling, I know I'm having a hard time, and yet I can't figure out exactly, kind of what I need. People maybe are offering support, maybe they're not offering support, but you may have people saying like, let me know what you need. And you're like, I have no idea what I need. So this is to think a little bit about that, to think a little bit about what are some of the barriers that get in the way of asking for help. And then how can you think about your support system in a way that really leverages the people who are there, but also helps you to see the gaps and where people might not be, and fill those in a little bit. So again, thanks to everybody for introducing and sharing where you are. If you want to share anything about who you're here remembering or what brings you on tonight, if this topic specifically was one that was interesting to you because you've been struggling with it, please feel free to share that in the chat as well. Also, no pressure to share anything. We are big believers that one of the things that is really nice is that not everybody wants to share, and you can just sit back and listen. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. I will just once more, actually, as I share, let me go ahead and get this up. I will once more put that link in the chat if anybody, because I know when I start the slides, if anybody wants the download link, it's there in the slides. In the chat, sorry for that, because you'll see some of these in the slides. So hopefully you should be able to see my screen now. And we're going to be talking about determining grief needs, and really beyond that too, like just this, I don't know what I need sometimes, but also I don't know how to ask. And so we'll talk a little bit about all of this. But before we get there, I think it's really important to acknowledge why it's so hard to figure out what we need. I think it feels like should be straightforward. It feels like why is it so difficult to know what I need? One piece of that is, of course, because grief is devastating, right? It shatters your entire universe. But I think it's so important to think about what then makes it so hard to figure out what could be helpful. And a framework that I really appreciate that has been introduced by lots of different people over the years in grief theory is this idea that grief is really a process of learning. It's a process of learning to live in the world without a person or people who have meant so much to us and have really been a stabilizing force many times in our purpose, in our day-to-day existence, in everything that we do. And part of what is so difficult in life after loss is we often can't anticipate exactly what is going to be hard. We can't anticipate exactly what is going to kind of knock us over and make it really hard for us to function on a particular day. We can see this if you had a loss that was maybe not one of those unexpected losses, but where someone was ill, you knew that it was coming. Oftentimes our brains will try in anticipatory grief to imagine what it will feel like, what life will be like when this person is gone, when we know that they're not going to survive. And yet when the time actually comes, we often realize there was no way to imagine the weight of what grief would be like. And so, grief is really this process of learning the world. And that means also learning over time these changing and evolving needs we have. What we need, 2 weeks after the loss is so different than what we need 2 months after and what we need 2 years after. And oftentimes we can't guess what those things are going to be. We can get a little better with some of the things we're going to talk about today of maybe building our awareness, looking at different areas. But some of this is knowing that it's going to be evolving, it's going to be changing, new things are going to be coming up. And this learning process, it's been being discussed since long before neurological research was happening around grief and neurology and what happens when we grieve. But it is being reinforced so much by the neuroscience research that's out there. I see at least one person mentioned that they've read The Grieving Brain before. And one of the things that Mary Frances O'Connor, the author, talks about so beautifully is how our brain is sort of this machine that is predicting our world all the time, and where we've mapped out our reality. And when someone who is so important to us is missing, our brain can't instantaneously update that map. It takes time. It takes time for our brain to start predicting the world differently. And instead of predicting that that person is going to be sitting there at the breakfast table or pulling up in the driveway, that our brain needs a lot of time to be able to start predicting differently. And so this is the same thing with our needs. Like, we may predict that we need certain things. It turns out that we're all wrong. We're really struggling in this period. So I say all this to say it's so important to understand that this is going to be a learning process when it comes to your needs as well. So many of you may have seen this before. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow is a developmental psychologist who introduced this idea that if our basic needs aren't being met, then we can't sometimes meet higher level needs. And so I introduce this here because one thing that sometimes is really hard and that we don't always acknowledge is that creating space for our grief, whether that's space to tend to our grief or whether it's just our brain even allowing us the space to really, engage and figure out how we will cope with life after loss, is incredibly, incredibly difficult if we are really busy worrying about our physiological needs, our safety needs. If you're figuring out how are you going to pay your rent, are you worrying about, the basics of clothing and shelter of your job? Has your job been jeopardized by caregiving or by, this possibility of relocations that sometimes have to happen after loss? All of these different things. If these things are feeling unstable, oftentimes that is what our brain focuses on first, right? It's how do I stabilize these things that are so important really for my survival? And if those things aren't in place, this isn't to say you won't be grieving and you can't be tending to your grief, but it is to say that it's normal if you feel like maybe you can't, or you're struggling to make space for that, or you feel like your brain has compartmentalized or sort of maybe you're feeling a little bit numb to certain grief emotions, because that is really an adaptive thing our brain does sometimes by focusing on that. Sometimes it might not be that it's the physiological and safety needs, but maybe one of the things that you are struggling with is that if you have a child or siblings or a surviving parent or someone else that you feel responsible for, that you're a caretaker to, and not necessarily a caretaker in the healthcare sense, but just someone who you feel responsible for their emotional needs. Sometimes we will put those people ahead of ourselves and we will focus so much on what their needs are that we lose sight of our own needs. And so one of the things that's really important and that I hope that taking space for tonight allows folks to do is to think about how we can, of course, still make space to tend to all these things, our safety, our physiological needs, the needs of those other people who we love and care about, and also make some space for our own needs as well. So to start with what we're going to think about is what we need from ourselves, right? Oftentimes when we think about needs, we think about other people and what do we need from others. But in grief and in so many areas of life, it's so important that we look at what we can do for ourselves and what we need from ourselves. Like I mentioned, sometimes we go to this default place of caring for other people. And sometimes what we need is to say, yeah, I want to be able to be there for other people. But in order to do that, I need to give myself permission to take care of myself first so that I have the resources to be able to take care of others, so that I have that within me, to be able to give. As they say, you can't pour from an empty cup. So we I really think that starting with this foundation of self-compassion is so important. And there's more interest in research around this. And part of this comes from the reality that in grief, many times we beat ourselves up. We think we should be doing better than we are. We compare ourselves to other people who maybe are in our grief support group, or other people we know who've gone through a loss, or people who we see on social media. And we think, why does it seem like they're functioning better than I am? Of course, often we're only seeing this small slice of how they're coping, but we have that tendency. We may also just have misconceptions about grief, right? If you've read any of our stuff, taken any of our webinars, you probably know we talk about so many of the misconceptions that allow us to think that our grief is going to unfold differently. We think the first year is going to be the hardest, and then we're caught off guard if we are one of those folks who find that the second year to be harder, which is completely normal. And yet many times people don't expect that and find themselves, beating themselves up that they're still struggling the way that they do. So self-compassion, is this place of being able to acknowledge our pain, and then to treat ourselves with kindness, and to treat ourselves sometimes with the kindness that we would treat others with. We oftentimes can be far more compassionate with others in our lives who are grieving, those other people who we've maybe, in our family, or who we've met through grief support groups or other communities. And so practicing this regularly. Kristen Neff is a self-compassion expert. That's her whole area of research. And she has a website dedicated to it. If you look up Kristen Neff self-compassion, and she talks about how we need to sort of cultivate this as a practice, thinking about how we can treat ourselves with that self-kindness that we would show to other people. Recognizing our common humanity. Often in grief, we compare ourselves to other people and look for those differences. But so often what's important is being able to understand that this pain of grief, the difficulty of being able to traverse life after loss, that this is something that so many people share, and that it's important that we can be honest with ourselves and with each other about it. And that then we have this mindful kind of awareness that we stay in the present moment and be able to connect with what we're dealing with at any particular time, and then tend to those needs in a way that is kind and compassionate. So there's lots of different tools for this. You may have seen us share this before, but just thinking for yourself about what are some of your basic kind of self-compassion, self-kindness needs. You can develop these for yourself. This is one example that Eleanor created that was sort of a way that she thought about what she wants to, at baseline, be tending to and giving herself permission for in any given moment. So thinking about how you might either resonate with this, or create something of your own that allows you to think about the ways that you try to treat yourself kindly and compassionately. Another piece, and this is shared in the worksheets that we share for you, is just starting small and thinking about what are the ways that you care for yourself, that you in grief look at as sort of the things that already can be helpful for you. And when you're having those like deep, dark, bad worst days. Having a little sheet like this is such a great tool to just be able to check in with yourself and go, have I done these things? Have I tried these things? The very cruel thing about our brains is that the moments that we are struggling the most are the moments that our brains struggle to remember who we can reach out to, what things actually sometimes help us, what are the things that 3 weeks ago when we were struggling were really made a difference to be able to kind of pull us out of a dark place. And so the best way to be able to have those things close to hand is to find a way to write them down and keep them nearby so you can check in with them when you need them, and write them down in a good moment, right? In a more positive moment, in a good day. Sit down and say, what are my non-negotiables? What are the things that I know, like if I don't take a shower and get myself dressed and brush my teeth and, whatever it is, if you're somebody who goes to the gym or somebody who tries to make sure that you have certain things in your routine and you need those to have a really good day. What are those for you that you feel like you want to give yourself and that you want to make sure that you're striving for, while of course still treating yourself with self-compassion and knowing there's always going to be those days when you're like stuck on the couch in your pajamas and haven't had a shower or brushed your teeth and are struggling and won't necessarily be able to get that into practice, but to be doing our best to at least identify and build our awareness around these things. Considering a lot of other things, right? Am I hungry, angry, lonely, tired? A good one, just to tend to ourselves. What are mood boosters? We're going to talk a little bit more about this, but knowing the things that may not be the things that are filling us with overwhelming euphoria, right? It's not joy like the way that we wish we could be feeling joy again. But just what are the things that give you that little bump in your day? Maybe it's playing with your dog. Maybe it is being able to get out and be in nature somewhere. What are the things that bring that to you? And kind of creating a list of those things. Who are the people that you can reach out to? Who are the people who are good supports? We're going to get into that definitely more about how to really look at your support system and leave your support, use your support system and lead them, in a way that can be helpful for you. So then my favorite distractions. One of the things that's so important to remember is that avoidance when it's chronic is not healthy for us, but avoidance in healthy small doses is getting a break sometimes. There are some times where we just need to get our brain out of a rumination cycle. We need to find ways to just have a little kind of break or escape. There's lots of support in modern grief theory about how important this is. We can't just be grief like all the time and not expect to feel completely drained and fatigued. And so it is important to know what are the things that do help me, that maybe get me into a little bit of a flow state where I'm able to let my brain kind of focus on, whatever it is. Maybe it's cooking, maybe it's gardening, maybe I really like to, work out and I get into a zone. But any of those things, it could be just playing video games. It could be anything that kind of gives you that healthy distraction. And places I feel calm. And, again, this is just like a place to start in thinking, how am I creating a little kind of cheat sheet for taking care of myself at the hardest times. So we then, of course, want to shift and think about, how our needs expand into both different domains of our lives and into our interactions with other people. So, of course, kind of these basic needs that we're talking about are so important. Am I sleeping? Am I taking care of myself? But ultimately, part of what is so overwhelming about finding support and coping in grief is oftentimes it has gone into every domain in our life, and not everybody in our life is right to be able to provide support and help for all of these different domains that have been impacted as in your grief and in your loss. So we have some tools in there, some resources and sheets to help to think about this, to think about some of these different domains, to help you to start thinking about how do you really break down and identify some of these things. You can start by just setting aside a little time to reflect on questions about like just life recently, right? Since the loss. What are things that have been feeling especially hard? What are the things you've missed? What has helped, right? What are the things that have been useful? What are the things that haven't been useful? Maybe it's things that you've tried, maybe it's things other people have done to try to show support. And when are the times that you find yourself feeling the greatest intensity of some of the difficult, painful grief emotions, feeling alone, feeling that deep yearning or sadness or unsafe or scared or overwhelmed, being able to reflect on these different times. Oftentimes our brains love to put things into categories, right? And all or nothing, like it good or bad. It's been a wonderful week or a terrible week. And one of the things that limits is our ability to really evaluate and spend time saying, wait, it's not just that the whole week was terrible. It's that this was when I was really, really struggling. Or this was a moment that actually within a terrible week, I actually had a really bright spot. And when we can start to notice those things, to start to build that mindful awareness of our days and our weeks, it helps us to see what some of our needs are, see what some of the things that are helping are, and work on building those a bit. So this can, to some people, comes really naturally, and to some people it doesn't come so naturally. In grief, everything is so often a blur that it can feel hard to look at things and do any of this assessment. And so this is just a sheet here that is giving a little structure to thinking about maybe how you can identify, even in the midst of the absolute destruction of grief, of all of this pain and struggling, what have been some of these moments that have been moments of respite. I love Deb Dane as a trauma therapist, and she talks about these as glimmers. And she says a glimmer is sort of the opposite of a trigger, right? A trigger in grief is something that activates us, that overwhelms all of our most intense emotions in grief and trauma. But a glimmer is a little bit of the opposite. It is one of those moments where we are able to maybe recognize that we're feeling safe, or that we're feeling calm, or that we're feeling a sense of awe or wonder or curiosity, or we're with someone who we feel connected with, or who we feel at ease with. Or maybe we feel excited about something or inspired. And these glimmers, like they might be brief moments, right? They might be, especially in very early grief, they can feel so fleeting. But what's so important is that we are able to recognize some of them, because that helps us to see, wait, like I see this glimmer here. And this is something I know I need more of. This is something that I hope that I can build on. And so when we start to kind of look backwards, to look at when we may have had these in the past weeks or months, it can then help us to say, how do I really look at the building on these as some of my needs and things that I can give to myself or that I can ask for from other people. The next piece that you might be thinking about and that can connect with those with some of those glimmers or those things where you're starting to see or look for, try to pay attention to some of those moments. um, it can sometimes point to or connect with some of these just different domains in our lives. These are things that can really connect to what we then later reach out to other people for and ask for support with. So it might be an emotional needs, right? There are maybe feelings where we feel like we really need to be able to talk to people about how we're feeling, or we really are struggling very much with a particular emotion, with something that we feel so much guilt or so much anger and are not sure what to do with it. And so being able to say, this is a really specific need I have right now. I need to find a way to be able to process some of this guilt or regret because it feels like it's consuming me. So being able to spend time thinking about what are the emotional needs. What are the spiritual needs? And, spiritual needs can be very tangibly religious needs, or they may be meaning and purpose type of needs. It may be feeling disconnection from your spiritual belief system or your faith, or feeling failed by God, or feeling a deep sense of injustice, or like things are unfair. And, it may be thinking about, what are my needs around this? Is it being able to talk to someone about this? Would it help me to do reading around this spirituality piece specifically, or to tap into that area if that's a struggle for me? Practical needs, we're going to talk a little bit more about this. And so often we have this laundry list of things that have become so overwhelming in grief, tending to just like getting our basic needs met, getting things taken care of around the house, dealing with estate issues, dealing with, now maybe we are for the first time having to figure out how to file taxes on our own, or take care of things that we've never had to take care of before because someone else in our life was taking care of those things. All of that are practical needs that can be stacking up and that are so important for us to be able to identify, even if we're not quite sure yet how we're going to reach out for support around some of those things. Physical and health related needs. There is so much research that shows us about the real physiological impact of grief. It can affect everything from our sleep and our appetite to having impact on our hormones and stress response system, blood pressure, cardiac issues. There's so many different things where there can be an impact. And sometimes we don't always make that connection. But being able to really look at this and be honest with ourselves. When we went back to that physiological, going back to that Maslow's hierarchy, if I haven't figured out how to get my sleep routine back into a functional place, and I haven't figured out how to get, sort of eating healthy meals on a regular basis, and actually, being able to tend to some of that stuff, it makes all of the other emotional work and practical work of grief so much harder. And yet it can be easy to dismiss this. Sometimes when I'm working with people, individually providing grief support, I always start with like a lot of this assessing where people are with some of this foundational physical stuff. And people will feel like, they're here to dive into the emotional stuff. But if we don't have that physiological foundation, digging into some of the emotional stuff is far, far harder for us to do. And it fatigues us so much more than, it's already fatiguing, right? But it fatigues us so much more. So looking at that, and are there needs? Sometimes the person who died is the person who was always great about encouraging you to go to the doctor or reminding you to take care of yourself in some of those ways. So this can now mean that we have to step into that role for ourselves, or we have to ask someone else if they can maybe help to support us in that. Our mental health and well-being needs, and our financial needs, again, which sometimes overlaps with some of our practical needs. Our remembrance needs, right? Being able to identify that sometimes what we want is to be able to just talk to people about the person or the people in our lives who we've missed. And we want to be able to share stories, or we want to be able to find, pictures of them that we don't already have or that we've never seen, or hear stories we've never heard. We want to be able to do some of that remembering. And what's tricky is that everyone's needs in grief are different. So, if you have 3 siblings and one of those siblings dies, you may find that one of your siblings really, really wants to be part of remembrance with you, and that the two of you really do connect over sharing memories and stories and photos. And then you may find that the other sibling really, that isn't how they're grieving. And that's not wrong. There's no, it doesn't mean they're not grieving properly. It just means that the way and the time in which they're grieving might look different than yours. And so, looking at our remembrance needs, and then as we get into thinking about support systems, really thinking about who are the right people to be able to tap into for some of these needs. And sometimes knowing that it isn't going to be people in our support systems, that we might have to find creative ways, we might have to find different spaces to be able to tap into some of these needs. Creativity needs, and relationship needs. So hopefully you get the idea of, sort of how one of the ways we can approach this when we're feeling so overwhelmed is by breaking down these different areas and thinking about different types of needs that we have. Now, doing this, it might come easily to you. And for some people, it doesn't, right? It's like, I still don't know. Even when I think through these different domains, I'm still struggling. And a place to start can be just at the end of the day, right? Reflecting back on just today, just before bedtime. Like, what was harder today than I expected it to be, right? Was it a practical, logistical thing during my workday that was really, really difficult? Was it a moment of really deep isolation that I was feeling, and loneliness that was part of my day? What were the things that felt hard? What felt better today than I expected, right? Being able to see that. What could have made today better, right? That being able to look at a hard day and ask ourselves that question. Maybe that's something that we could have done for ourselves. Maybe it's something that we could have reached out to someone else for. It's not to beat ourselves up and to say, oh, why didn't you do this better? Or why didn't I reach out to this other person for help? But just to be able to reflect on it so we can use that information tomorrow or in the future to say, how do I start trying to slowly build in some of these things that might help to make today just a little bit better than yesterday? And is there anything that could bring some ease around this tomorrow? Thinking about what that might look like. So just these, these basic questions, asking ourselves these at the end of the day can be a simple place to start thinking about what some of our needs are. The one other tool that's in this resource, of worksheets, and I should have said this at the beginning, but don't get overwhelmed by like all of these different sheets and ideas and different ways of looking at this. The intention isn't that you're gonna like jump in and do all of this. It's that we like to share a lot of different approaches and ways to think about your needs, knowing that some will really resonate for some of you and not at all for others. Or one might be really helpful right now, whereas another isn't. But in 3 months from now, one of these tools is much more helpful than it was today. So these are just different ways to be thinking about your identifying your needs and different ways to consider it. This one here is from a workbook that we shared with some folks at the beginning of 2023. We'll reshare it at the beginning of 2024, an updated version. But it can be really used anytime. And again, it uses this idea of sort of reflecting backwards and looking forwards. And so asking ourselves the questions of, as I'm taking care of myself, as I'm tending to my grief, as I'm looking at the things that have been helpful for me or haven't been helpful, what is something that I want to stop doing? What is something I think I need to do less of? What is something that I think is really important to keep doing? What is something I want to do more of? And what is something that I want to start doing? And these can be really, really small, simple things, right? They don't have to be big, grand things. But they're a way to just start looking at areas where we may have some needs that we could start tending to, and then figuring out if I want to do less of something or I want to do more of something. If that feels important, then what resources do I need to be successful, right? What, in order to do less of that thing, what would help me with that? In order to do more of it, right? Maybe I want to get back to volunteering, which was something that I really enjoyed before my loss, and I stopped doing, and I really want to do more of that, or to start doing that again. If that's something that I'm looking at to reconnect with that need that I have, to maybe because service is a value for me. What do I need? Do I need support from someone else to do that? Do I need to take some specific action steps, right? Do I need to reach back out to somebody, email somebody? What steps do I need to take? To really start thinking about not just what do I want to be able to do differently, or what might help me in my grief, but then what do I need in order to be successful with those things? Oftentimes when we look at this, right, some of these things are things that we might need from other people, that is really support that we want to ask other people for, whether that's emotional, whether it's remembrance, whether it's that spiritual or creative. Like, it's about sometimes more than just what we can provide from ourselves. Community is so important to us as we grieve. Support systems are so important. There is so much research about this. It is a time that, it is a time when the thing that we have feared the most, right? Losing someone we love has happened, and we can feel so alone, right? And so that connection with our support systems is so important. And yet sometimes we feel more distant from our support system than ever. We feel like no one understands what we're going through. We, can feel like we're really struggling to get the support that we need. So, the first thing we always encourage everybody to consider is, what are our own barriers for asking for help? There are so many things that can be our own personal barriers, the stories that we tell ourselves, that allow us to talk ourselves out of asking for the help and support that we need, for reaching out in the way that we would. So this, a simple one is just, maybe you've never been asking for help. You've just always been somebody who's been comfortable being strong and not as comfortable being vulnerable. I hate this idea of strong, right? Of that somehow not asking for help is strong in so many ways, right? Asking for help is the much, much harder thing for many of us. And so really it takes incredible strength to be able to ask for help. But sometimes that is way outside of our comfort zone, because we have thoughts like, I should be able to cope with this on my own. Maybe you have done some of that comparison of, I know somebody else who's gone through this and they didn't seem to need support. I don't trust that people can or will help me, which, sometimes that's true, right? We're let down by people in our support system, but sometimes in a way that is almost self-protective, we don't give people the chance to prove us right or prove us wrong. We just decide or worry that people won't be there for us. And so we then just unfortunately don't even ask for that help. And so it's so important sometimes that we challenge some of these stories we're telling ourselves. We push back a little bit and say, wait, I need to give people the opportunity to prove me right or prove me wrong, rather than just assuming. I don't know who to ask. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. People have been helping, but just not in the way that I need. And I feel ungrateful asking for something else or something different. And so this might be, where you've realized your needs are just different than what people expect. And it's hard for you to redirect people. I need help, but I don't like the feeling of needing help. That's a big one for a lot of people, right? I don't like this feeling of needing it. And so I'm just going to sort of ignore it and hope that it goes away, which unfortunately is often not how it works. So, assessing your own barriers, there are many other barriers that aren't on this list, right? Sometimes it's that you have been repeatedly failed by other people and disappointed by people, and you don't want to set yourself up for that failure again. But asking yourself these questions and doing a little bit of that pushing back, right? And saying, okay, this is the story that I'm telling myself. And is this something that is helping me or that is harming me, right? Is this, and I'll talk about that a little bit on the next slide. So once you've, done some of that work of identifying your needs that we've talked about, whichever different approach or strategy or thing that you may use to identify some needs that could help and support you in your grief, it's important to ask, could someone help me? And who? And, and do you know that does this come easily or not, right? Some of this is, no, it's not somebody else that can help. It's me. It's something I need to work on for myself. And that who question, you may very immediately be able to see who could, or you may need to think about it a little more. We'll give you a little bit, a few ideas on how to do that. But with these kind of stories that we tell ourselves about asking people for help or reaching out for some of these needs, one thing that we sometimes see that's important to look at is that our reaction in grief, especially early on, it comes from these very self-protective places, or it comes from really those habits of how we've operated in the world before, how we've felt comfortable in the world. If I'm not somebody who has ever been good at asking for help, my reaction is after a loss is probably to do what I've always done, which is to not ask for help, to try to be really strong and self-sufficient and not have to lean on other people. Or if I, after my loss, felt like people really disappointed me, they weren't helping me in the way I expected, I wasn't having my needs met, then my reaction might have been, I'm just going to pull back from everybody. I don't want to set myself up for more hurt from other people. I've been, disappointed by people. They've said hurtful things to me. And so sometimes our reaction, again, is that self-protection. There's this really kind of important idea in mental health, which is that reactions are normal, they're natural, they're something that we do to protect ourselves in so many situations. They almost can feel like just our instant instinct. And they may really help us in the short term, but sometimes over the long term, they don't actually end up being the most healthy or adaptive way of coping. They're the thing that we needed in that self-protective early moment. But over the long term, we might need to take a pause and look at our reactions, evaluate them a little bit, and say, all right, do I want to kind of continue with this reaction? Do I want to continue coping in this way? Or am I maybe going to respond differently? And now that I'm looking at this, I realize that my reaction isn't helping with my long-term adjustment and coping. And do I want to shift that? And asking for help, this can be a big area where we can start to see, you know what, I'd like to start responding a little differently. My instinct was to, not ask for help, or my instinct was to, kind of cut people off if they didn't get it exactly right at the very first time at the beginning. But maybe now I want to revisit some of those things because I am feeling a little bit isolated, or I do see these needs that are emerging in these different areas of my life, and I want to be able to seek some support for this. There's a beautiful quote from Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, that I really think is sometimes important when we think about reassessing our needs and reassessing how we reach out for support or how we support ourselves. And he says, between the stimulants and response, there's a space. And in that space lies our freedom and power to choose our responses. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And I think one of the things that we believe is so important is remembering that we are active participants in our own grief, right? We do have these moments where we get to decide how we're going to respond. And sometimes that means saying, oh, my reactions, I don't blame myself for them. I'm not beating myself up for them. I needed them at the time. But I need to now work on sort of evolving some of those things, to shifting my response a little bit to take care of myself differently. So, got a blank slide there. Oh, let's see. Okay. What did we miss? All right. I'm not sure. Okay. I think we missed a slide there. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but so we are, let me just check. Oh, hold on just one sec. Okay. I see what slide we missed here. So this is, and it's in your workbooks. I don't know why it's not displaying here for me. But it's a slide I want to make sure to mention. Because it is a really important one, and it is about how we can think about our support system as really a network of people who have different strengths and different weaknesses. And one of the challenges, I'm going to see if I can share this differently so you all can see it, is that oftentimes we want one or two people in our lives who are, close with us to meet all of our needs, right? We want one or two people to be all things to us. And unfortunately, that's just not how it works. People often cannot be all things to us for so many different reasons. And let's see here if I can. Here we go. Share this with you all. Let me see here. Hopefully you're able to see that. So this is the sheet that you'll find in here, and this is just one way to think about this. But we have used this idea for a long time of thinking about our support system, sort of like back in high school, if you had in your yearbook or high school newspaper, right? Most likely to succeed, best dressed, like all of these superlatives to kind of describe people, thinking about what their strengths are. And this can be really helpful when we think about our support systems in grief. There are going to be people who are really amazing at helping us to get the lawn mowed and to figure out how to file our taxes, or some of those practical needs. And they may absolutely not be the worst person to be a shoulder to cry on or to listen without judgment, right? And so we sometimes need to work on our own flexibility of saying, can I start considering all of the strengths and all of the weaknesses of my support system? Can I recognize that for certain things that I'm struggling with, for some of these needs, even though they're connected to my grief, there are things that I can maybe ask some people who are a little further outside of my inner circle. Sometimes in grief, we feel like the grief support it's so emotional, it's so intimate. We feel like it should be those who are closest to us all the time, who are the people that we're going to. But sometimes with these different grief needs, it turns out that the people the closest to us may not be the best person for some of these needs. They may be grieving themselves. And so it may be hard for you to be supporting each other if your needs are a little bit different. So this is, and there's another sheet which really has space for you to think about your own needs and to be able to think about who are some of the people who could meet some of these different needs, and how do I push myself to think outside of just my usual go-to people if I feel like my kind of usual go-to people aren't necessarily meeting some of these needs that I have. And so, with that, it can be important to also realize that sometimes we need to give people feedback. Sometimes we're feeling like people aren't supporting us the way that we hoped that they would, or they are missing the mark a little bit in the support that they're trying to provide to us. And providing feedback can be really tough, especially when we're grieving. Sometimes we feel like they should just know what we need, or they should know that thing they said was hurtful. But we did a survey, this was a couple of years ago, where we had well over 1,000 responses, and we asked people, before your loss, if you go back before this whatever the thing that brought you to what's your grief happened, do you have situations where you regret things that you said or didn't say, or did or didn't do for people in your life who are grieving? And 97% of people answered yes. And, we weren't surprised at all, right? Because so often we look back and we can see the ways, especially after a loss, that we wish we had done things differently or supported people differently. So oftentimes people are missing the mark, not because they want to be failing us and disappointing us, but because they're struggling to know what to do as well. And so the um, and so when we think about how do we give feedback, some people are really good at being able to just give feedback, be honest with their friends and their family and their support systems, and say, this is what I need, not that, or this was helpful. Some people are not so great at that. And so this is a skill that comes from dialectical behavioral therapy. It's just a way to help us to kind of organize our thoughts and have a little bit of almost a system of how we can ask for things, how we can describe our needs or give people feedback directly in a way that can feel a little bit more comfortable if you just don't even know where to start with the conversation. So it's, dear man is the way to remember it. But it's just describing the current situation if necessary. Might be one if you're giving somebody feedback of saying, I appreciate so much that you've been picking my daughter up from school every day. Because maybe that's what that person thought would be helpful for you. But you then may want to be expressing your feelings and opinions about the situation, right? That saying, that I really have appreciated it. And also I've realized that that's actually not what is feeling useful for me right now, or isn't necessarily the thing that would be most helpful. What would be most helpful is X, right? It's this other thing that I need. And, share with the person that, you feel like why this would be helpful for you or how it would be useful. And so, reinforcing it, being mindful of thinking about what we're asking for, and feeling confident that we know our own needs. Unfortunately, sometimes other people think that they know best, right? I just had a conversation 2 days ago with someone who was feeling incredibly guilty because they had neighbors who had set up this big meal train, and they were like, we don't want any of these meals, right? And they tried to have a conversation about this and had a hard time because that person was sort of insistent. The person who had set it up was sort of insistent that this was really going to be helpful for them. Because a lot of times in grief, sometimes what happens is people assume that what would be helpful to them is what's going to be helpful for you. And sometimes you're having to respond and say, no, wait a minute. I need you to listen to what my needs are right now. So being able to think about those different things and really be confident that you do know what you need and you are able to ask for it. So this is just a way to organize your thoughts if you're thinking about having some of those conversations. Sometimes it's describing the situation of feeling like people have not shown up for you in the way that you wanted them to, of being able to describe that situation of saying, hey, I haven't heard from you in a while. I'm really feeling pretty lonely and isolated right now. I know maybe you have just been really busy, or you felt like I needed space right now with everything. But actually what I really need is for people to reach out and check on me, or to encourage me to get out of the house, or to organize some things that we could do, to be able to describe that situation and ask for what we need. Often if we've been feeling hurt that we feel like people have ghosted us, or that they haven't been there for us in that way, sometimes that is when we go right to that reaction of like, oh, they're a bad friend, they're terrible, I just want to cut them out and not engage in that conversation. But sometimes that's coming from that self-protective place when we haven't even given them an opportunity to be able to see if they can repair the situation, or see if we can give a little prompting that would help them to be able to know what we actually need rather than what they may be assuming that we needed. So this can just be, a different way. It's okay to give this feedback and just think about it. Maybe you don't like this whole very systematic Dear Man, like it's a very structured thing. But you may just want to practice. Some people, again, feedback can be hard, but there is really good research that shows that when we give feedback to our support systems, when we ask directly for the things that we need, people end up feeling much more well supported in their grief. It's just hard because, like, when we're already struggling, the idea of giving this feedback and guidance can be really hard. When I look at the research, one of the other things that is interesting is sometimes they encourage you to wrap in, if there is somebody who's really useful, who's been really supportive and wonderful, or one of those people who has said, please let me know what you need. Sometimes you can say, hey, what I need is actually you to maybe help some of the other people in our friend group or in, my life to be a little bit more supportive, or to maybe learn a little bit more about grief or understand what I need. And so sometimes what they found, and they did a research study about this, they found that if you felt like it was too much on your own to give that feedback or ask for certain things that you need, that sometimes you can solicit a helpful, supportive person in your life and network to be able to talk to some other people and to be able to say, hey, actually, Jason's really been feeling X, Y, and Z. I talked to him about it. Some of the things that he could really use are, these things. Some of the things that really haven't been helpful are these things. This I think would be really some ways that we could help him to feel more supported. So sometimes thinking about whether there's a helpful person in your life that you might be able to enlist for that. And then the last thing is just to keep in mind that sometimes we don't have those people right in our support systems. And so we have to look at professional options and looking at different resources in our community or online. Sorry, I don't know what's going on with my slides, that some things are not showing up, but this has a sheet where you can just make some notes about thinking about individual counseling, about support groups, about community resources, things that, again, could be as simple as recognizing that if cleaning the house has felt so overwhelming to you and you haven't managed to be able to do it, do you have somebody who you can ask, a friend or family, for some support? If you don't, maybe it's saying, can I reach out to some community resources? Maybe it's, do I hire somebody, if I can afford to do that, to help me to clean things up or to get to a place where it at least feels manageable again. Or many communities have resources that have folks who volunteer who will come and help with household tasks that are feeling overwhelming to people or that they don't have the physical ability or skill set for. So looking in your community to see if there are resources like that that may be able to help. So just, really comprehensively, like doing this full circle of these things. And then just taking, notes from other people, being able to ask people, if you know others who are grieving, what resources have been helpful for them? What have they, as they did some of this needs identification, what have they found in that has been useful, especially if you maybe know some folks who are further along in your community out from a loss, or if you're connected in online communities, whether that's What's Your Grief or other online communities, to be able to ask some of those questions. So I know we went a little over time. We usually try to keep these to an hour, but there, like I said, there's a lot in packed in here. I saw some people asking about the worksheets. I will email them out again to everybody who was registered, but I just put the link in the chat again that has some of these worksheets. I definitely hope that like some of these tools are useful. This is one of, concrete, practical, hands-on tools. We try to do different webinars throughout the year. So please keep an eye out for the next one. We will have one probably not next month. Yeah, or maybe probably the end of November, beginning of December. We'll have another topic coming up. Also, our Griever Hub will be open for new members coming up around that same time, end of November, beginning of December, where we do a lot more, webinars, but also more a forum and support to be able to connect more with each other. So if you want to be on the wait list for that, I'll include the link in the follow-up email that includes the worksheets. And you can always email us when I send that follow-up email. If you have questions, if you have any, any resources you're looking for, if you're realizing, wow, there are big gaps in my support system, when I try to sit down and go, who could meet this need? Who could I reach out to? Coming up empty. And what does it look like to seek professional support? We're always happy to try to help to steer you in the right direction, to share resources that we know, things like that. We have, even for really practical things like sorting through belongings, figuring out where to donate things, or creative ideas for, kind of memorializing objects and things like that. We have a lot of information on the website. You'll probably know if you're here, there are hundreds of free articles and podcasts and things like that. So you can always check out whatsyourgrief.com for more. And thanks for hanging in, everyone, and for all of the conversation in the chat. I'm sorry that it was hard for me to be looking at the chat at the same time while I was presenting things. But I'll hang on in case any last questions or anything that I missed. If you wanted to put them back in the chat, if I missed anything, please feel free to do that. And otherwise, I hope that everyone has a really great rest of your evening. And we will hopefully see you sometime again soon. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the kind words. And I don't see any questions coming in. So with that, I will sign off for good. Thanks, all. Have a good night. Oh, I see, Annabelle, your question. Slide 4 references, see those pages. That's referencing our book. Which some of those worksheets refer to some pages that are in the What's Your Grief book. But definitely you don't need the What's Your Grief book for that. I think those are still on there. Please, yeah, you can disregard that. Or if you have our book, it references the pages that are in our book. Oh, yes, absolutely. Lynn is not wanting to be a burden or wanting to abuse friendships. And I think this is such a common challenge, like feeling this worry. And sometimes having a conversation with friends and articulating that, like any conversation we have, if we can lead with our anxiety, it can really help, of being able to say, hey, I've really been struggling to talk to you about this because I've been worried about X, Y, or Z. We kind of lay that anxiety out there from the beginning, and we allow the person sometimes to listen with an eye on that worry that we have. But sometimes in this case, we can say, hey, I've been struggling to ask for some support or some help that I could really use because I'm worried about feeling like a burden or feeling like, that it's going to get to be too much for you. Can we just talk about that so that you can let me know, you can assure me that if it does get to be too much, or if I am asking too much, that you'll let me know, that you'll say like, I'm sorry, I don't have the, sometimes in the chronic illness community, right, they'll talk about spoons, right? I don't have the spoons for that. I don't have the bandwidth for that. And to be able to say to them, you're not going to hurt my feelings if I ask for something and you say, I'm sorry, I love you, and I just right now I have too much other things going on. And sometimes that can help you to feel more assured that you're, that they've assured you that they're going to let you know if they don't have the bandwidth or the energy. And so I think being able to lead with that, and sometimes being able to think about if they knew, if a friend knew that we weren't reaching out for that reason, how would they feel? And sometimes we can think about that by imagining if we were in the situation, right? If I knew that one of my friends wasn't asking for some of the support that they needed or the help because they were worried about being a burden or abusing the friendship, I would really, really be disappointed. I would really hope that they would talk to me about it and be able to let me know so that we could kind of make sure that I could both provide that support while also being mindful of my own bandwidth as well, and that we can do that. Oh yeah, guilt and regret. We've definitely done sessions on guilt and regret in the past, and I'd be happy to do that topic again. So I'll, I can probably, I was going to, maybe for the next one, or if not the one after that, we can definitely repeat that topic because I think it's always a popular one. Colleen, I just reposted it in the chat, but I'll, the worksheets that were in here, but I will also email it out. Fear of being judged prevents you asking for help. And I think that is a common one as well. And I don't think there's an easy answer for that, but because one of the things that's hard is that our fear, let me stop sharing here so I'm a little bigger on the screen. Our fear of that, part of what's hard with this is like, right, in some ways we're never going to know, right? Like if somebody's silently judging us, we don't know about that. But one of the things that I think is so important to remember is that even though we feel so alone in our grief, so many other people have been through loss, or they will go through loss, and they will understand, right, at some point, or they have understood just how hard it can be and how important it is to be able to support each other and to be able to ask for help. And oftentimes we operate as humans from a place of fear and anxiety. We're wired for fear and anxiety. Unfortunately, it's how our brains work. It was a self-protective feature. We're born with it because we want to be part of the tribe. We want to be protected by the people who love and care about us. And we worry about judgment because we worry about not being part of the tribe, about being different, about being weak, about, all of those things. And so sometimes we have to do a little bit of work, push back and say, you know what? I do have this fear. It's a natural fear that so many of us share. And if I don't find a way to ask anyway for the support that I need, or to share how much I'm struggling, I'm never going to get the support, but I'm also never going to know any differently, right? I'm never going to get a chance to prove to my brain that even though it was so worried about me being judged, that actually when I asked for that support, people seemed not judgmental at all, or they were, willing to help me. That isn't to say there aren't cases where, we do feel like people are judging us and things like that. But again, testing that in the world, right? Giving people the chance to prove us right or prove us wrong is something that is so important, because otherwise we go on in that sort of, in that kind of isolated place of not pushing our comfort zone with that, and then not receiving some help or support that we could have. So I think that, these are really, really common, really common challenges on asking for help. And, I will say, I think it is something that gets easier with practice. I think a lot of people talk about this, that it can get easier with time. Being able to just, once we've done it and we've gotten past some of those immediate fears, it makes it a little bit easier to push ourselves, because we realize, wow, it wasn't as bad as I thought, or maybe it was pretty bad. It was really hard to ask, but I did then get some support that I really needed, and so that felt good. So I think, yeah, Julie, I so appreciate what you said about, sometimes opening up opens up for other people to share their stories, and that it opens up a space for mutual support. And I think so often that is true, and people suffer in silence, right? And then suddenly, when there is a space to realize that there's someone else who may connect with this, who may have had another grief experience and share that, it does open up spaces for mutual support. Yeah. I completely, that my brain is just so tired of being let down, and sometimes that asking for help leads to more disappointment. I think this is absolutely something that is, I think, a real challenge. Is once we have been let down, it's hard not to want to just protect ourselves from having that happen again. It's like, I just want to shut down. Why would I want to put myself in that position again when I've already been disappointed by other people? And I think it's a risk, right? We can't say, oh, wait, no, that's not going to happen. It might, right? And so part of it is looking at that risk benefit, and then also, or, risk reward, and also just remembering that it's so important to not assume that just because a certain person has let us down, that means everyone will let us down, or that, a small group of people have it. Sometimes it is about finding that, finding that persistence, even when it's hard. Sometimes labeling the anxiety there can work as well, of being able to say, to people in your life, to be able to say, like, I really do need some support, and I'm at this point where I'm struggling to ask because I have felt really disappointed or let down by people in the past. So I want to communicate really clearly kind of what would be helpful for me. And I also hope that you can let me know what you can do and what you can't, right? Sometimes the reason we get disappointed is because people promise us things that they then don't follow up on. They say they're going to, be there for us in certain ways, and then they're not. And so sometimes being able to ask people to be honest with us about what they're capable of what they have the bandwidth for, can help. And to say, I would rather know right now that this is just not something you have space for, than to kind of be expecting it or anticipating it and feeling let down when you're not able to provide it. So, I wish there was an easy answer to that one. But I just think that is, that it's a tough one. Yeah, finding that people hijack conversations and feel more alone. I think that RP, that is definitely something that other people experience as well. I think it's really difficult. We have this tendency as humans, we want to find this like shortcut to empathy. I mean, sometimes people really are making it about themselves and they want to talk about themselves. Sometimes it's the empathy shortcut. It's like, oh, I share that I'm coping with this thing, and that person wants you to believe that they empathize and understand. And so then they're like, oh, I know how you feel because blah, 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 blah. And the intention there is like, I'm trying to connect and show you that I have some sort of empathy or shared experience. And unfortunately, it can really backfire and do exactly the opposite, where we feel, like you said, more alone, where you feel like it's made it about them, and where that can be, I think really hurtful. And so I think, again, it can feel awful to go, okay, now I need to like work on how do I redirect these conversations. And, but sometimes that is in the moment, the best thing that we can do is to be able to sometimes redirect the conversation and to just say, either exactly what we're kind of looking for, or just to say, I appreciate you sharing, this with me. And also, like, I'm just holding so much of my own grief right now that I'm finding it really hard to kind of hold the weight of other people's grief right now as well. And so I know I'm not in the best place to necessarily have this conversation. Because sometimes we have to be able to put a boundary there, or to be able to say, and this happens in support groups. Like, I think people really underestimate sometimes that going to a support group can be tough, because it's a place where suddenly we're bringing so much of our own grief there, but there's also sort of this, need for us to be able to hold other people's grief, right? To create space for that. Or sometimes where, that can happen in conversation. So sometimes we do have to be mindful about how we set some boundaries, or we get more comfortable communicating what we have the space for and what we don't. So I think that it is, definitely helpful. Oh, what's a helpful approach if not expressing understanding through experience? So I think the really important thing to remember is that understanding through experience, it's often not it often isn't actually understanding, right? Like, just because if you have a mom and I have a mom, that doesn't mean I understand anything about your relationship with your mom and you don't about my mom. Just because I've gone through a death and someone else has gone through a death, it doesn't mean I understand anything about what they have gone through. And so I think that one of the things that becomes really important is that, is that listening. It's really being able to say to people that I want to understand. And sometimes actually when we have shared experience, it becomes a barrier to us being able to empathize, because we assume that what someone else is going through and what they're feeling and, what is helpful and not helpful, and that relationship they had, we assume that it looked like our own experience, when sometimes it may have looked radically different. So I think oftentimes approaching things from a place of curiosity, I think, is something that can serve us really, really well, of being able to, and that doesn't mean we never share that we have a shared experience. But certainly I think it can be saying, maybe I lost such and such a person too. I know how hard it was for me. And I want to be here if you're open to telling me about how things are for you, or what you're struggling with, what's been particularly weighing on you. Being able to open up a space to ask people to talk about their experience, and not assuming that our experience means that we know about their experience. So, I mean, that's, again, every situation is a little different, right? Sometimes there are situations where it really is what somebody needs to have that shared experience. So it's not to say that's never helpful, but sometimes it's not helpful. It just depends on the person, right? Yeah, Sharon, support group did not work for me. It was completely draining, and I felt like I was failing at the healing task. I think this is a really common, and I think under talked about experience, because there are so many people who feel this way. I feel like our Griever Hub actually is like a little haven for that, and because of people who have felt that way. And I think it's because one of the things we talk about is that we try to have this very wide range of different things people can engage with. So there's the forum where you can connect with other people, or you can just show up for webinars like this, or tune into things to listen to, or watch old recordings, or get like more worksheets and workbooks and things like that. And sometimes we have a lot of people who are like, I had tried support group after support group, and I was feeling so drained. And so I think sometimes they're looking for a space where it's like, can I find some options that don't require me to do that heavy lifting when I haven't been able to even kind of figure out how to carry the weight of my own grief yet. And so I think, I say that just to say it's totally normal. I think we hear that a lot. And I think really in support groups, I think it's so important to help people from the get-go to think about what their self-care looks like after groups, how they take care of their own needs, how they're able to kind of recognize if it's getting to be too much and too overwhelming, because sometimes it can be, and that is definitely not failing at the healing task. It is just that it's heavy, right? It's wonderful to gather with other people who have been through loss and who can be open to hearing about our experiences and not shy away from them the way we may feel like other people are shying away from them. And it is no small feat to be able to do that when you're carrying the weight of your own loss. So I definitely feel you on that. Okay, I think that I'm just looking to see if I've missed any other questions that have come in. Colleen, where can you get What's Your Grief book? It's bookshop.org, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, all the kind of regular places. And it's also on our website, that I would say our website's actually not probably the best place to get it, because unfortunately we can't compete with all those like shipping, all those places that can do cheaper shipping. But it is available there, and you can, if nothing else, you can read a little bit about the book there. I'll put a link. And that link has links to all the other places that you can buy it. So if you look at that link and you're interested. All right. Well, thank you everyone for hanging in this evening. And if you, like I said, after this, if you think of any other questions, I'll send out an email that just has the worksheets again and everything like that. And also a few articles that are related to what we've been talking about if you want to do any follow-up reading. And you can always reply to that email if you have any questions or anything else that you think of after this, and happy to see how we can be of support. So take care, everybody. Have a good evening.